Today, we're going to talk about the truth functional connective that we'll call disjunction. Now, disjunction is a truth functional connective that in English is usually expressed by means of the word or, O-R. But there are a couple different ways of using that word or. Let me give you some examples. Suppose you ask me, who won the game last night? And I say, well, either Manchester won it or Barcelona won it. But there, I'm clearly trying to indicate that while Manchester may have won it and Barcelona may have won it, they didn't both win the game. If Manchester was playing Barcelona last night, then they couldn't both have won. Right? Soccer doesn't work like that. Either one team wins or the other team wins, but they can't both win. So if I say either Manchester won it or Barcelona won it, what I mean is that either one of two possibilities occurred. Either Manchester won it or Barcelona won it, but they couldn't both have occurred. But sometimes, when I use the word or, I don't mean to convey anything like that. For instance, suppose I say to you, this is breakfast or lunch. Now, I'm not suggesting, when I say this is breakfast or lunch, I'm not suggesting that it can't be both. It could be breakfast, it could be lunch, or it could be both. And when I say this is breakfast or lunch, I mean it could be one, it could be the other, it could be both. So there, in that second usage, I'll say or is inclusive. It includes both of the options and the possibility of their both being true. In the first usage, where I said either Manchester won or Barcelona won, I'll say or is exclusive. In other words, either one is true or the other is true, but they can't both be true. So or can be used exclusively to mean that either one of two options is true, but they can't both be true, or could be used inclusively to mean one of two options could be true or they could both be true. Now, the truth functional connective disjunction is expressed in English by the use of the inclusive or, the or that leaves open the possibility that both of the two options could be true. So, what's the truth table for the truth functional connective disjunction going to look like? Well, you're going to start with two possibilities, two propositions that are connected by the truth functional connective disjunction. Doesn't matter what the propositions are, just call them P and Q because it doesn't matter what they are. So there's P, there's Q, and then there's the disjunction of P and Q, which will symbolize as follows: P disjunction, which looks like a V, Q. Now, when is P disjunction Q going to be true? Remember, disjunction is expressed by the inclusive or, so it's going to be true whenever P is true. And it's also going to be true whenever Q is true. And, of course, since it's expressed by the inclusive or, it's going to be true whenever P and Q are both true. So, the truth table for disjunction is going to look like this. Right? The first three lines, the lines that consider the possibility of P and Q's both being true, or P's being true and Q's being false, or P's being false and Q's being true, and all three of those lines, the disjunction P or Q will be true. The only scenario in which P or Q is false is the scenario in which P and Q are both false, in which neither P nor Q is true. Now that we've learned the truth table for the truth functional connective disjunction, we can use that truth table to figure out when certain arguments that use disjunction are going to be valid. For example, consider this simple argument. Premise 1, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand. Premise 2, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. Conclusion, I'm going to tickle you with either my right or my left hand. Is that argument valid? Well, it obviously is valid, but you can use the truth table for disjunction to explain why it's valid. Look at the truth table for disjunction again. In this argument, we have Premise 1 being the proposition, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand. Premise 2 being the proposition, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. And a conclusion that's the disjunction of those two propositions. Well, what can you tell from the truth table for disjunction? What you can tell is that in a situation in which P is true and Q is true, in which both of two propositions are going to be true, the disjunction of those two propositions is also going to be true. You see, that's what you can read off from the first line of the truth table. In a situation in which each of two propositions is true, their disjunction has to be true. So, in the argument that I just gave you, which has as premise 1, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, and as premise 2, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand, that argument has to be valid because the conclusion of that argument is simply the disjunction of the two premises. So there's no possible way for the premises of that argument to be true while the conclusion is false. If the premises of that argument are true, the conclusion has to be true. We could think of that argument as a kind of disjunction introduction argument because, just as in the case of a conjunction introduction argument where the conclusion introduces a conjunction that wasn't there in the premises, in this argument the conclusion introduces a disjunction that wasn't there in the premises. Right? There were two premises, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand and I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. The conclusion introduces the disjunction of those two premises. The conclusion just is the disjunction of those two premises. But notice, even though that disjunction introduction argument is valid, there are even simpler disjunction introduction arguments that are valid. Consider, for instance, the argument that starts with just one premise. Could be anything, call it P. And that draws as a conclusion the disjunction of P with anything else. So let's say P is the premise, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, and then the conclusion is that it's just the disjunction of that premise, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, with any other proposition, like say, I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. That argument is going to have to be valid, and you can read that off the truth table for disjunction. Because you can see that in any situation in which one of the disjuncts of a disjunction is true, the disjunction is going to have to be true. So any disjunction introduction argument that starts with just one premise and that concludes the disjunction of that premise with anything else, any such argument is going to have to be valid. There's no possible way for the premise of that argument to be true while the conclusion is false. So all disjunction introduction arguments are valid. But what about disjunction elimination arguments? Well, remember, conjunction elimination arguments are valid because if you start off with a premise that states the conjunction of two propositions, then the conclusion that is either one of those two conjoined propositions, either one of those propositions, the conclusion is going to have to be true whenever that conjunction is true. You saw that from the truth table for conjunction. But what about with disjunction? Does it work that way with disjunction? Well, consider an argument that starts from the premise, I'm going to tickle you with either my right or my left hand. And then it draws the conclusion that is simply one of those two disjoint propositions. Let's say it draws the conclusion, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand. Is that argument valid? No, it's not. Because there's a possible situation in which the premise, I'm going to tickle you with either my right hand or my left hand, is true, while the conclusion, I'm going to tickle you with my right hand, is false. Namely, the situation in which I'm going to tickle you with my left hand. In that situation, the premise would be true, but the conclusion would be false. So that disjunction elimination argument is not valid. And you can also see that by looking at the truth table for disjunction. If you look at the truth table for disjunction, you'll see that there are three possible scenarios in which the premise, I'm going to tickle you with either my right hand or my left hand, is true. The three possible scenarios are the three scenarios in which both of the disjuncts are true, the first disjunct is true and the second one false, or the first disjunct is false and the second one is true. Well, there are three possible scenarios in which that disjunction is true. When I say I'm not going to tickle you with my right hand, I'm ruling out two of those scenarios, namely the two scenarios in which it's true that I tickle you with my right hand. But that still leaves open a scenario in which it's true that I'm going to tickle you with either my right hand or my left hand, But for the disjunction elimination argument to be valid, it would have to be the case that in every scenario in which the disjunction, I'm going to tickle you with either my right or my left hand, is true, each of those disjuncts is true. But that's not the case, and you can see that just by looking at the truth table for disjunction. So the truth table for disjunction shows you why it is that disjunction introduction arguments are all valid, but simple disjunction elimination arguments that start with a premise that's just the disjunction of two propositions and end with a conclusion that is simply one of those disjoint propositions by itself, those arguments are not valid. You can see that by the truth table from disjunction.